The draft is about 1 week away. 49ers may take your favorite player. They may actually take a kicker in the first round. Who knows? You guys will know all that information right after this. What is up, faithful? I'm one of your hosts here at Clutch Gene Sports with my main guy, Rohan Chakravarthi. How's it going, Rohan?
I'm doing good, man. I mean, like you said, the draft is 1 week away. We've had this limbo, where we've kind of just been waiting, and now I'm just glad, it's pretty much almost here now.
Man, a lot of people we truly might take a kicker in the first round, man. Like, who knows? It's draft 1 week away. Let's get wild with it. Definitely excited about the draft. For those who don't know, we will be on a joint show. So make sure you guys subscribe to the channel. We will be doing a live stream live during the draft. So make sure you guys go over to Clutch Gene Sports, over to Rohan Chakravarthi's personal channel. Hit that subscribe button. We will be live with the old man Jesse Naylor, who I am now doing weekly shows with on Thursdays. So you guys could tune into that as well. But on Thursday would be me, old man Jesse, and even older man David Lichty, all on the show together, giving you guys his first take to every pick live on air. But
yeah,
we have a week to go, Rohan. A lot of news and chatter going on about Brandon Ayuk being traded, and the 49ers may have a deal in place, or the Steelers are coming in hot for Brandon Ayuk. What are your thoughts on this going on with Brandon Ayuk? Like, is Brandon Ayuk going to get moved? And do you think the Niners have a trade in place for Brandon Ayuk?
Now, you've heard a lot of things, and I mean, it's not just this week. You've heard a couple of things over the offseason as a whole. Brandon Ayuk obviously hinting at a few things with, the cryptic social media messages that as a lot of guys wanting extensions kind of do nowadays. The main takeaway I kind of have with this is Brandon Ayuk has interest around the league. That is true. And so you definitely see Brandon Ayuk having some value around the league. Teams like potentially the Pittsburgh Steelers who have reached out. But I think that there would be a multitude of teams lining up to trade for Brandon Ayuk should he become available. But ultimately, I think the main point that the 49ers are trying to showcase, and you'll definitely see it come, like the inflection point is the draft, is they don't have an interest right now in trading Brandon Ayuk. I think that that's kind of been their stance the whole offseason. Sure, the negotiations have probably gone one way and maybe not in a way that Ayuk has necessarily wanted, or he has been himself. I'm not even going to go there because in my opinion,
I have a question though, because what makes you say that the Niners don't want to move him?
Oh, what the Niners don't want to move him?
Yeah. What makes you say that?
For a couple of reasons. One, when you look at not even going with what they've said so far, when you look at the plan that the Niners have instilled on a year-to-year basis, they've aligned themselves so that Brandon Ayuk can be here for the entirety of Brock Purdy's rookie contract and potentially into the first year of extension where his cap hit won't be that high. You're trying to align that contract up to where you don't take the brunt of the hit, but you maximize the window. And so let's say Brandon Ayuk gets 3 more years. Well, guess what? You have 2 years where Brock Purdy is still on a rookie deal. Then you have the 5th-year option, which would be the 3rd year, and then you might have an extra year where you have flexibility. But ultimately, I think it's truly that Brandon Ayuk has the chance to explode in a wide receiver 1 role. The Niners are going to try and look to combine young talent with elite level talent. Ayuk falls in the latter category. But more importantly, I mean, it's coach speak and all, but you've heard the Niners consistently say throughout the process, Brandon Ayuk doesn't want to be traded. If you go to some of the main media sources that a lot of people go to, Ian Rappaport, Adam Schefter, while they understand the desire for Brandon Ayuk is to get paid, ultimately, they don't believe the Niners are entertaining any calls for Brandon Ayuk. And so right now, it seems like there's interest for him, but the Niners are unwilling to trade him. And I think whatever the reality is will come to fruition probably by the draft.
And for me, I don't think Brandon Ayuk's going anywhere, man. Like I see a lot of this chatter, a lot of this. I said it before when I asked about the Jaguar situation. It got laughed at. Like I was like, "Hey, what's up with this? Like, why are people saying that there is a trade rumor to the Jags and that Brandon Ayuk wants to go there?" And the guy I asked was in the building. He laughed. I was like, "That's bullshit." Like he's like, "No." He was like, "Jags have nothing to do with Brandon Ayuk. They called, we hung up, then nothing happened there." I asked about the Steelers. After that, again, nothing happened. What I see from this report, and like the thing that the way it was worded is the Steelers really, really want Brandon Ayuk. Like it's like okay, hey, I want $1 million. I'm not gonna get that, right? Like it's like there's some things you could really, really want in life, but you're not gonna get. And Brandon Ayuk isn't one of them for the Pittsburgh Steelers. Um, so that's where I think it's very interesting, where a lot of people are throwing Brandon Ayuk's name out there on if he could be moved or whatnot. Now, as of right now, the Niners don't want to move him. They aren't planning on moving him. They have a contract that they have in place for him, not necessarily where they're negotiating, but in their minds where they could get fit. Their plan is to get Brandon Ayuk's deal done after the draft. They do not have plans for Deebo Samuel on this roster post 2024 season. After this season, then they're going to have to figure something out on who to pair with Brandon Ayuk, whether that's a rookie, whether that's free agents. They're going to do something there. But
Right.
for looking at the draft, it could be a secret deal or a secret thing they have in place. For example, you're not going to necessarily pass up on a top tier offensive lineman for Brandon Ayuk. And what I mean by this is just because right now you have a plan in place to get Deebo Samuel off your contract list next year, extend Brandon Ayuk this season. There's a thing called opportunities that present themselves. For example, let's say Troy Fatanu starts falling to the late teens,
Oh my
right?
God. It's so funny. I was going to wait for you to finish. I was literally just going to bring up the hypothetical. I know we talked about the Jaguars and the Steelers. Let's say Fautanu falls to 17. The Niners want Fautanu potentially. And, but I'll let you fill in the blanks. I mean, that's the guy who I was thinking as well.
It could be Fatanu, it could be the Oregon State tackle. I cannot think of his name right now.
Kalisi
Uh,
Fuaga. Yeah.
Fuaga, it could be one of those guys that they really like, who they think is a top tackle in this class. If they're there, you gotta present the opportunity to the rest of the staff. Hey, you know what? We could get this for Brandon Ayuk. We could get that first round pick plus a second. But we're gonna have to give up pick 31 and probably a later pick in order to swap and make it a fair trade, which you're not gonna get ripped off on either side. So if that happens, they may move up. Now, what does it take, Rohan, for you to move up into these picks? And I know I see a lot of questions there. We'll get to those questions right now. We do have a little bit harder of an out today on my end. I'm a little time restricted a little bit. But what's a deal, Rohan, that you could get to that you will move Brandon Ayuk for?
That's a good question because it relates to this question here. Didn't Stephon Diggs garner only a second round pick? Remember that second round pick's also in 2025. Would a team actually offer a first for him? Now, I do believe that there are differences between trades for guys like Stephon Diggs, Amari Cooper back in the day, Keenan Allen. There are differences in those trades, even with the current landscape of receivers where, as they get older, as more talent comes into the league and as you're on a bigger contract, it's tougher for you to obviously, it's tougher to hold those contracts, but also it just decreases the value of those receivers. Ayuk, though, is in a completely different boat. He's several years younger, on the ascend, but more importantly, has one more year of team control on a fifth-year option. Whatever team that trades for Ayuk isn't going to view it. Let's say Ayuk gets a 3-year extension. They're not going to view it as a 3-year deal. They're viewing it as a 4-year investment because they're also taking on that fifth-year option for Brandon Ayuk here, which essentially, let's say, just hypothetically, it's a 3-year deal worth $80 million. It's not a deal where you're paying $26 million a year for Brandon Ayuk. It's a deal where you're paying 4 years for $94 million or 4 years for $92 million. And they view it in a different light because you're able to get Ayuk get a little cheaper for one additional year while having flexibility on a guy who's younger, where you could potentially, 3 years into the deal, like a lot of teams are doing, or 2, 3 years, however long it is, you could flip him and get somebody or get capital in return when you have to make a different investment in another position. As for a trade, though, in place for Brandon Ayuk, you look at the trades that have happened with receivers in his position specifically, in the draft before. A lot of people look at a first round pick around a mid first round selection as the thing for Brandon Ayuk. Now, will that ultimately happen to fruition, and will a team be willing to trade that type of value for Brandon Ayuk? That is a question I'm unsure, just because this is a stacked receiver class where there's a good amount of talent that could go in the first round. A team might have to question, do we prefer having Adonai Mitchell, one of the best receivers in this class, at pick number 17 or pick number 20, when we could have, him on a cost control deal for 5 years, or should we go for a more proven option in Brandon Ayuk? There's a cost that the other teams kind of have to look at and try and evaluate, because nowadays, with receiver contracts exploding as much as we've seen in the past, and with the market only growing, there's a desire to get younger. And when you look at good teams and teams that have star quarterbacks, especially where they're paying big deals, the goal for all of those teams is getting younger at receiver. You see it with Josh Allen and the Bills this year. You're seeing it with the Chiefs. You're seeing it with teams like the Chargers, potentially even the Dallas Cowboys, And so I think that it would require a mid first round selection, but I don't think that ultimately happens. What do you think?
I mean, it's very hard to see guys like Ryan G. Hensley in the chat who don't even like to talk to us in real life or invite us onto his show anymore.
Shots fired. Shots
So
fired.
it's kind of crazy that Ryan's in here and he says he can't see your name, and that's okay. So I'm going to go ahead and do something, because Ryan obviously doesn't know who you are. I'm going to go ahead and put you on that side so Ryan can see you. But shout out to Ryan G. Hensley Show. If you're not subscribed to Ryan G. Hensley Show, make sure you guys go subscribe to it. He also has another channel where he interviews millionaires. If you want to learn how to make some money, how to invest and stuff like that, make sure you guys hit up Ryan. Now, even if you're trying to get a house. So for me, one thing I see, this is false. This is fake news. Don't let him lie to you. But he did. We should probably be on it, depending on our schedules. But for me, Brandon Ayuk is a guy where there's receivers where you look at them as really good receivers in the NFL, and there's receivers that are dudes, right? And Brandon Ayuk, he's in that dude category. He's one of the top 12 receivers, top 10 receivers. I know a lot of Niner fans like to put him in the top 5. I'm not putting him there yet. I don't think he's in that category just yet. But when you look at Brandon Ayuk, the Niners aren't going to give him up for free. I see a lot of people saying, "Oh, they're going to give up a second. They're going to get 2 seconds." The Niners aren't giving up no 2 seconds, because if you give up 2 seconds, you're hoping a receiver falls to 31 to draft someone. You're hoping one of those guys in the second round you take can become a Brandon Ayuk. I don't think the Niners are planning on doing that. I think the Niners understand their Super Bowl window is this year, and this year only, most likely. So when you attack this draft, you have to go in all in. Brandon Ayuk's on the roster, even if he doesn't get a deal this offseason. He's on the roster. In order to get back to the Super Bowl, you're not getting back to the Super Bowl with guys who are not good receivers. And what I mean by not good receivers is we don't have any other receivers on the roster who could beat man coverage. Like that's the biggest issue, is if you can't beat man coverage, what a lot of teams are going to do are exactly what the Cleveland Browns, Baltimore Ravens, and the Kansas City Chiefs did to us this year. Play man and blitz heavy. Play man and blitz heavy. What did that cause for the 49ers offense to look? Very dysfunctional in the Super Bowl. There was a lot of times where free runners were coming. Debo couldn't beat man coverage. Jawan Jennings had a much better game. But if you have Jennings in that predominant role, things aren't going to be as smooth for the 49ers. You're going to have stacked boxes to go on top of it. Rookie receiver really going to play right away? We know what
That's the
Kyle
question.
Shanahan did to Brandon Ayuk. And Brandon Ayuk said he's been public about it. He's put it on his Instagram. He's had his best friend tweet about it. He's been public. So for me, I don't think the Niners move him, but if they do move him, it has to be for a 1 at least. I'm not. And me personally, I'm not doing no pick swap.
I
I'm not
agree.
getting pick 15 or 17 or 20 and giving you 31 in exchange for that. Because to be honest, I'm losing out on that deal. I'm giving
Yeah,
you a first round and Brandon Ayuk. Like, no, I'm gonna get my tackle and I'm gonna get a receiver at 31. I see a lot of people saying, "Oh, Brandon Ayuk is only good enough to get a second because of the the deal that was mentioned. Diggs only going for garnering a second. We also got to remember, Diggs one has character issues. He's constantly a diva, right? And I get you could say Brandon Ayuk's being a diva right now, but when Brandon Ayuk's contract isn't it's like an issue, we have never seen Brandon Ayuk be this. We've seen him go in, show in day out, like a pro, and handle his business. That's for sure. So I don't
yeah.
think they're gonna get. They should get more than a second. Also, the Houston Texans were stupid. They ended up restructuring his deal, and now it is a 1 year
I
rental.
don't. Yeah, I don't know about all that, but when you talk about, I really liked one point you brought up, which is 2024 is an all-in year for the 49ers. When you talk about the retool they're going to have to do in 2025, there's going to be some changes with this roster. This roster likely is not going to be as good in 2025, or is going to rely a lot more on younger talent as the Niners try and, balance between the future and the present. And so, with that said, the question I continuously come to, if the Niners' goal is to compete in 2024, is Brandon Ayuk going to be better or worse than a rookie receiver for you in that number one role or number two role or whatever it might be this year? I don't think there's any argument, really, any receiver in this class where you can say you can guarantee they're going to have a bigger impact than Brandon Ayuk in 2024. Yes, they might in the future, sure. But I think if you're going for it in 2024, there's no other receiver that you'd prefer on this team than Brandon Ayuk to kind of lead you through that charge. And that's what ultimately I believe forces the 49ers to extend him, when the time comes to it.
So the Niners did make a little interesting signing, right? They did go out and get an elite receiver, an elite punt returner, a slot guy that is known as Trent Taylor. Jesus Christ, Rohan, what are they doing?
They're bringing in competition, just a camp body. That really, there's not much to this. I don't really care in the sense that he's a good guy, great guy. I mean, character was great and all of that, and I mean, obviously gels with certain people in the locker room. But if you're talking about a role for him, I can't really see much as other than maybe a back end receiver on the roster where he predominantly is in a special teams role. But yeah, I don't know.
Good
There's not
vibes.
too much to take about this. Yeah, good vibes.
For the
Good
vibes. Good
vibes, good
vibes.
leadership, good character, all of that kind
We
of
like just
stuff.
handing out. We just like bringing guys back who run it back times 10,000. Any player who's been on the Niners, just run it back. I think it's an interesting signing. I don't think it's smart in terms of, yeah, you're bringing in competition, but if he does end up making the roster as a punt returner, Jesus Christ, like, don't have anything
Yeah,
better than Trent Taylor. You want to be safe and just catch every punt, like that
The
to
reason
me.
though, the
Weird.
reason I will say I won't overly hate it as of now is the Niners don't have depth at receiver. They don't, and so you'll wait and see what they do in the draft. I think that'll ultimately dictate how Trent Taylor's roster spot ultimately goes. Because could they go for two guys in the draft? I think that's a realistic possibility at receiver, but they don't have any depth. You don't really look at guys behind the top three as anybody behind the top three, in my opinion, is a true lock to make an impact at receiver this year, especially with Ray McLeod gone. And so I'm fine with the competition aspect, given that you have 90 spots and all of that. Do I think he'll make the team? At the moment, I'd probably say no. Wouldn't be surprised if he does, but I think it ultimately depends on how the Niners approach the draft at receiver.
And what's crazy is Trent Taylor is a extreme training camp receiver. He's a good route runner, great separation. He's gonna look great. That's gonna be something that's crazy. What's crazy about it is he's been healthy the last 3 years. Was with the Bengals for 2 and the Bears for 1. We all know what the Bears receiving group is. He's had in the last 3 years 8 receptions for 103 yards. That's pretty elite. I just don't get it. I really don't. I this is a stupid signing in my opinion. I'd rather you go out and you get 2 undrafted free agents over Trent Taylor. Like I don't Anthony Gold late in the 6th round out of Oregon State. Like if we're trying to get a slot receiver with return ability, go get Anthony Gold. Um, I have heard the Niners do like Polk, but they also do really like Jalen McMillan. They also really love, really, and this is like Kyle Shanahan really loves him, Javon Baker from the University of Central
From
Florida.
UCF. Yeah,
Yeah,
no, that makes
he loves
sense.
him. He like
And that
absolutely
that's my
loves him.
favorite one, I think, of the three too, in terms of where you expect to draft him. That is a guy who I see just Niners. I just see Niners all over him.
Absolutely. Now, the Niners obviously they're in a tricky situation. They're in a spot where they're picking at 31, so you might not have a player that falls who could is elite right away. But I feel like they have there's contributors there at 31 that you could find. But the conversation that we need to have is there a secret plan to trade up or trade down? Do they have someone who could potentially replace a player immediately? Do they have, for example, an offensive tackle in mind that, you know what, if he falls to 22, we got to, or 21, with which I believe is the Miami Dolphins, who don't have any picks? Do we trade up and go get him? I think that's something that's very in play, as well as, hey, I've heard and it's been reported the Commanders really want to trade up into the first round for an offensive tackle. If the 49ers don't think offensive tackle is the best player at 31, can they get 2 seconds or potentially a second and a third to trade down a few spots and get a guy like Rosengarten in the second round? If you had to choose trading up or trading down, where would you do right now?
This is actually a really good conversation because we've had conversations about my thoughts on trading up and down in the past. I personally, initially coming out of the combine, I felt that the 49ers were going to need to trade up if they wanted one of the top offensive tackles in this class. I don't think that's necessarily changed. I think that if they have a certain guy on their board, that trading up makes sense to do so. But I have been when I've thought more and more about it, I think there is good value in trading down. Why? Because at the bottom of the first round in those 31 and 32, it's a bit of a premium when you're considering trades, not necessarily to a great extent, but what is the value of having a pick at the end of the first round? It secures that 50-year option, and a lot of teams would be interested, especially when you consider a class like this, where certain teams might be higher than others on a guy like Bo Nix or a guy like Michael Penix Jr., two quarterbacks who teams might want a 50-year option on, especially given the uncertainty around their development and how long it'll take for them to be pro ready. And so I could see a team trading up to secure the 50-year option. But then you could also see the trade, you could also see the Niners themselves trading up. And I would assume that would likely be for an offensive lineman of their choice. I think that there is a lot of flexibility the Niners have here. And so it'll be intriguing if they just stay pat. I think if they stay pat, I don't know. I Jesse Naylor, when I last spoke with him on the show, he talked about how he personally feels that staying pat is the worst idea. And I think he's talked me into the logic there. The reason being, if the Niners have a guy that they want, they should go up and get their guy. Especially if they don't believe he'll make it to 31, they should go up and get their guy. However, if the Niners want to stay pat, there's likely an array of players that they feel comfortable in at 31 that they would be willing to take a first round pick on. I don't think that they're going to just wait for one player to come off the board. There's likely an array of players at 31 that they're comfortable with. And if that's the case, you have a couple of teams in the early first round or in the late first round that are certainly having buzz about trading up. You talk about the Washington Commanders, they're at 36. You talk about the Arizona Cardinals, they're at 35. They've been looking into potentially getting a third or first round pick after having 4 and 27. And then, there are other teams on the board who might also entertain a quarterback. Obviously, right now, the buzz is the Patriots wanting a quarterback at 3. Could they potentially trade out of that spot and then potentially get another first round pick by trading back up? There are a lot of options, but I think right now, the trading up or down possibility is a little more appealing to me than potentially, what do you call it, than staying pat at 31. If I were to choose, I think the Niners, I would advocate for a trade up. I would advocate for a trade up over a trade down. I think the Niners, if you're talking about immediate impact, you're obviously, in my opinion, going to get better talent if you're looking to trade up and secure a player of your choice. If you're looking to trade down, it might not be a guarantee that that guy's going to be an immediate impact. I'd look to trade up and get one of those top offensive tackles on the Niners board.
For me, I'm in a situation where I think you should stay. Honestly, you could truly stay pat, unless your plan is to trade up to go come get receivers, or trade up to get more position players, or add more quality players. Because I know we have 11 draft picks, right? But 11 draft picks doesn't mean you're going to get 11 good players. You're probably going to get 3 or 4 out of the 11, which is a success. So when I'm looking at it, I truly think the Niners could stay pat at 31. Trading down is probably a better reality for me than trading up, because if you're trading up, any team that's going to trade down 15 spots is going to want a first round next year. Like they're going to like I don't see a team taking pick 31 and 63 and possibly 94 for pick 15. I don't see that happening. Like I don't get how a team would um make that kind of deal for themselves. So I think you'd have to give 31 and a 2025 first round pick. And I think that's where I'm like, I don't think it's worth it, because at 31, you don't necessarily have to get an offensive tackle, right? Like I know a lot of us want offensive tackle because that's the more bigger need at offensive line. But you could get a guy like Zach Frazier, a starting center. You could get or have Zach Frazier if you truly like um Brendo at center. You could have Zach Frazier play right guard for his first year and then kick him over to center. So like you could truly get a starting caliber offensive lineman at 31. But if your goal was to get starting offensive line, but then get another receiver or a corner early in the second round, for example, if the Niners could get a second round pick or 2 second rounders from the Commanders for an offensive tackle, like if the Commanders like, hey, we really like Kingsley Suamataya, he's there at 31. Can we go ahead and get him at pick 31? What can you do for us? Well, give us your 2 seconds or whatever team wants to make that kind of deal. If you could get a Roger Rosengarten in the mid 40s, or if you could get a TJ Tampa at corner, Max Melton, I know someone in the chat loves him. If you could get two of those guys, it's a success, because you're getting 2 quality starters that are probably going to be starting for you within the next 2 years. But I truly don't see the Niners moving up or down. I think they stay pat at 31 and take someone, because they need to hit on a fifth year option kind of guy. What that allows you is that extra year of flexibility for cap purposes. For example, Brandon Ayuk, the Niners took him in the first round. They don't have to extend him. If he was to take it in the second or later, they would be forced to have tagged Brandon Ayuk, and they'd be having to pay him mega millions right now, which would have caused them to move off of guys like Debo, Kittle, or other guys. So I definitely think there's an option where you could stay pat, but I think it's more realistic that they move down, because I'm not giving up a 2025 pick when you have to think about guys like Debo, guys like Kittle potentially next year, Aaron Banks next year, Dre Greenlaw, Charvarius Ward, and Amon Lenore. So we also had to look into the future in terms of who's a free agent and who's going to be on the roster. And I think that's why you either stay pat or you go down. I'm passing on Cooper DeJean. Said it on the show with Jesse Naylor. I don't think he's a good fit for the Niners. I don't think he's a good player in the NFL. I think he's better suited at safety, and I'm not taking a zone corner at 31. But Rohan, a lot of things you could do. I also want to know, what position do you think the Niners take first? Do they draft best player available, or should they draft legitimately for the need? And I know a lot of people hate drafting for need.
Yeah, I think they position themselves well to take best player available. I really do. When you look at their draft, even adding an extra corner to try and solidify that position for 2024, especially now. So to me, I just look at the board specifically, or what you expect to be there, and that's where I evaluate the position. I don't think cornerback is the pick at 31. Meaning being, I think the Niners are going to look for a mid-round corner this year to try and fill the hole for 2025. I don't think that they're going to go after a first-round corner, understanding that you've got a couple of bodies in there, but more importantly, I just don't think the board fits what they're looking for at 31. I expect guys like Kool-Aid McKinstry to be gone. And so if the top 3 corners are gone, I don't have a first round grade on another corner where I'd be comfortable taking them in the first round right now. And so maybe you trade down and take one. I just don't see it being corner for with the board specifically in round one. Elsewhere, I think though you could take a lot of positions. A guy who we saw in a mock draft recently was Johnny Newton out of Illinois. Personally, I did not think Johnny Newton was going to initially be there at 31. However, his injury status could potentially make him fall, although he did look pretty good in a recent pro day, of course, and so that might reboost his stock. But if he falls to 31, I think defensively, if you're looking at the defensive line, that's a guy who you could consider taking. He's going to be a contributor for sure in year one, and then a starter in year two along the defensive line and defensive tackle. Potentially what the Niners might have initially hoped for in Javon Kinlaw, a bit of an undersized defensive tackle, but he's explosive. Doesn't really have injury concerns overall, but he's a guy who's explosive. He's a guy who could be a good pass rusher for the 49ers, and I think a guy who could fit well on the interior for them. But then, of course, there's an array of offensive linemen. I think there's an array that you could definitely consider yourself taking. I can very clearly see that position. And I'll throw out the other position that I think has picked up steam a little bit, receiver. I think the 49ers could very well look at a receiver this year because when you look at receiver in round one, well, first of all, we pointed out with the Ayuk talk how Deebo Samuel is not expected, not expected, but unlikely to be with the team in 2025, or at least the Niners are going to move off of one of their top two receivers by 2025 because of the contract situation that they're going to kind of be forced to handle. And so I don't expect Deebo Samuel on this team next year. Additionally, Jawan Jennings, unrestricted free agent. We're going to need at least one receiver, the guy who likely slots in as your wide receiver 4 this year. But I could see a receiver being the guy in round one. You develop him this year, and then you also you know he's your number 2 option, or maybe even number 3 option, depending on George Kittle in 2025. And so I think there are a couple of positions. I truly do think they're in a good position to take best player available, which is why I hope they don't reach for a certain player. But I think that those 3 positions are the ones I'd probably kind of look for the most. The 2 trench spots, and then probably receiver.
And I think this draft, the way it's gonna fall, it's you could actually draft for need. And what I mean by that is the need is likely going to be a position, or is going to be the best player
It's going to be
available.
best player available. Exactly. Yeah.
So like what's crazy is like I know a lot of people are like, oh, you better just draft best player available, don't draft of need. But like when I look at it, it's right guard is a need for the future, left guard is a need for the future, so is center. Offensive line is a huge need, whether it's center, guard, or right tackle, right? So when you look at it, there could be a potentially a tackle, a guard, or a center all available as the best player available, and it's a position of need. Zach Frazier there at 31, easily one of the best players available. Or a guy like Graham Barton, who's projected to become a center in the NFL. Those kind of guys change your organization on the offensive line. So you could get one of those guys at 31. Receiver, I know a lot of people are talking down on Adonai Mitchell right now because of his diabetes issue. I know scouts are saying like that's a big thing where he doesn't take care of it and stuff like that. I don't think that's true. I don't think you're that great of an athlete if you have like if you're not taking care of your diabetes. Like that's not gonna like you're not gonna be able to play well at all. You're not gonna be able to function well on your day-to-day life. I think that's a negative in terms of what they're saying on him. It's also we also gotta remember these are agents putting these reports out there. What agents are trying to do is get a guy to fall so their guy climbs him. So that could be also too if Adonai Mitchell's there at 31, easily you could take him. There's also guys there at corner, right? Like you were mentioning, are how high are they on other corners that are not going to go? Nate Wiggins from Clemson, how high are they on him? There's a lot of options. I know you and I aren't high on him, but a lot of the league is a little bit higher on him because of his
Yeah.
athletic ability. So like for me, it's like all right, there's a couple of dudes at positions needs. And for me, I think that's one of the best things to have for the 49ers is the flexibility to go best player available or draft for need in this draft class. Because if you have an offensive tackle who is maybe a of a grade, and like what I mean by grade, for example, let's say you have um, Jordan Morgan or Kingsley Suamataia as your 35th ranked guy, right? But you have a receiver or let's say defensive tackle who's your 30th ranked player, that's not much difference. That's not a big difference. And at that point, you're literally getting the same kind of athlete, similar projection. You could literally go that offensive tackle, and that could technically be a good pick. So for me, I don't mind what they do in this draft because it's actually going to fall to 31. If it falls how I think it's going to fall, it actually falls in favor for the 49ers. In the second round, they could go and get a guy like Max Mountain, trading up and getting Max Mountain, who they're really high on. In the third round, they could even trade up again, go get a receiver, Javon Baker, who they're really high on. I don't think he's going to last that long. You have a lot of later picks. You could start trading up into the draft to get your guys or get a position of need like a Javon Baker. They also really like Cornelius Johnson later in the draft. A lot of things the Niners could do. Me personally, I'm going position of need this draft just because I think the way it'll fall
It
is going
matches
to
best
be
player available.
matches best player available. And it sounds weird saying that because I'm a best player available guy. Like when every time I do a mock or when I look at other people's top 50 prospects, when I look at them, like, oh, that's perfect because if we're going off of this, usually NFL is pretty accurate in terms of picking the best player available. The best player could be an offensive tackle. It could be a
Which is,
receiver.
you never see that. You never do. That's
Never.
just the uniqueness of this
Rare.
class. And that's where I want to throw a question at you, specifically looking at the offensive line. A lot of people, like you said, are honed in on offensive tackle. I'm also a guy who likes a lot of the offensive tackles in the first round or projected to be in the first round of this class. When you look at an offensive tackle, maybe let's just talk about a guy like Kingsley Suya-Mattia. In a realistic scenario, the 49ers pick him. He might not start year one, but he could be the starter of the future, maybe even the starter on the left side in the future. What I want to ask is, would you prefer taking an offensive tackle that might not start year one, but is a guy for the future? Or would you prefer maybe going on an interior offensive lineman who you think could start year one at either the center or the right guard spot? Because I think that those spots, the Niners, especially at center, the Niners might find a day one starter in the draft, potentially Zach Frazier.
That's a hell of a question because I personally think offensive tackle is going to be a huge need once Trent Williams is gone. So you definitely have to think about the future at offensive tackle. And I don't think it's going to be easy for a center or a guard to come in and replace Brendel or Feliciano year one. I think Kyle is pretty set in stone at the center and guard spot. But if they come in and they produce and they're drafted really high, I don't see the difference between a guard competing or an offensive tackle competing because it's not like it's a set player, like a really good player starting at that position, right? Like there's our center and guard, I think they're C average players. Our right tackle, I think, is a C average player. I think so. It's not necessarily like we're asking an offensive tackle to beat out a really good player or someone who's like really like that's not that big of a deal. So if he did sit year one, I'm fine with it because you're probably going to have that guy replace Trent Williams next year and you're drafting for the future. And you're not going to have guys come in at receiver and start right away. You're not going to have a corner come in and start right away because they just drafted a lot of depth. The nominal Lenore is there. It looks like guys are going to compete for the slot role as well. So I don't think that's going to be that big of a role. Like it's not a big need. Linebacker, you're going to have to beat out the two rookies from last year and a guy they just signed in Campbell. Like there's no real like immediate needs for this year. So you could draft positional need and have that guy sit 1 year and it's not going to affect your roster building for the future.
I want to throw one more at you because you just said, right, you could draft for a need, but then kind of have that need be filled in the future where they eventually project as a starter potentially as early as 2025. Do you believe, though, with the way the 49ers roster is constructed, that they need a immediate contributor in year one with one of their top three picks? Do you think, let's just consider they stay pat, 31, 63, 94. Do one of those guys have to have a big role this year, or are you comfortable with a significant portion of this class, including all three of those top guys, potentially projecting for need, but projecting for need in the future where they evolve into starters next year?
I think yes. Like one of those guys need to be contributing year one right away. Now, what position would I hope for that position is corner. If I had to choose, it'd be corner. If you could get a guy to come in year one and solidify the corner's job, outside of Charvarius Ward and Demo, you're pretty much set because now you could extend Demo, let Charvarius Ward walk, and it gives it a little bit easier and flexibility for the years to come. I don't like right tackle. Yeah, you could have a right tackle come in year one and start. I don't think that right tackle is going to come in and start and be a Pro Bowl player, which that means it's not going to be that huge of an upgrade of over Brendel. Even though I'm super high on Sumataya, Rosengarten, and Morgan to replace Brent McKivitz, I think they can replace McKivitz. I just don't think it's that big of a jump from McKivitz to the rookie you take, where it's gonna put you over the hump. The offensive line, in my opinion, wasn't the biggest issue in the Super Bowl. I thought play calling, and then you got to the Super Bowl. I thought play calling. I thought your quarterback missed some reads. Your quarterback stepped into the pocket a little too often when put himself into pressure, which as an offensive lineman pisses you the hell off. I think your quarterback and head coach need to understand that they're playing man coverage and they're sending pressures to you, so you can't keep throwing the ball to Debo Samuel. Like that's a given. So I think at the end of the day, it's not necessarily that the Niners don't have the talent at offensive line. I think they were blitzed a lot and they weren't prepared. That's coaching right there. That's quarterback not knowing who his hot route is, a quarterback going the wrong way on his progressions in a hot route. So for me, a lot of things. I think if you do get a guy, hope for it to be a corner, because you're gonna have to go up against an elite offense to win a Super Bowl. And I think Ambry Thomas being on the field kind of hurts your defense. Having two safeties who are similar, so again, a safety in a way too, who could take away the deep third. Just I don't really see, even though I think they should go offensive tackle at 31 or offensive line at 31. I don't think they're going to start year one. I think this going to, at least not week one. I think it'll take them a few weeks to get into the groove of things. And if they do start week one, then that means Kyle was pretty happy and we got ourselves a really good offensive lineman at pick 31.
I agree. I mean, I've kind of been on this probably since the combine in the sense I don't think whoever comes in, they could start by the end of the year. I just don't believe a starting offensive tackle specifically will start year one. I think there are a couple of centers who you expect to potentially start in year one. And I mean, the reason is you're going to get maybe tackle 7 or tackle 8 in the class, whereas you could get center 1 in the class or, guard 1 in the class, given the positional value and where those guys ultimately could fall. I think you could get a starting interior offensive lineman week one. I don't think the guy who you expect to draft at tackle starts week one, although they could grow into that role.
And pretty much that's it for me. I know I got a time restraint, Rohan. I don't know if you want to keep going.
What I'll do is I see a couple of questions in the chat. I'm going to go back to the beginning of the chat. I'll answer all the questions, and then we'll hop on out of here today.
Perfect. So, Clutch Gene Sports, make sure you guys do me a favor. Go over to Rohan's personal channel. Hit that subscribe button as well. If you guys have not subscribed to Clutch Gene Sports, hit that subscribe button. Thursday, we will be live tomorrow, I'll be live with Jesse Naylor of Last Second Sports. Before the draft, we'll be doing a watch party. It'll be a joint show. Me, Rohan, David Lichty, Jesse Naylor of Last Second Sports. Make sure you guys check that out. And make sure you guys are following us, man. We really appreciate everyone for keeping the comments really live. I really appreciate all you guys for tuning in. I'm out. I got to go. Rohan's here. Rohan, I'm going to do you a solid. I know you don't have a banner for just solo, do we? Do we have the
Yeah,
solo
we do.
one?
I think we got one.
Oh, for sure. All right, Rohan, I'm out. Thank you, brother, for handling those questions. I appreciate you, bro.
Hey, thank you. And yeah, I'll end today's show with just answering some of these questions. So if you guys got them in the chat, be sure to drop them down. That's what I'll be doing to end today's show. We'll start at the very top. Going back to the conversation about trading at 31. One of the reasons I said that I'd be cool with a trade up, trade, or a trade down, if you talk about it, is when you talk about trading up at 31 overall. The reason is I don't think this is a deep class. I don't think that the talent in the 4 to 7 rounds 4 to round 7 is as deep as you normally see. Why? because in today's world in college football, with NIL being such a big player, especially this past year with COVID eligibility and all that kind of coming into fruition, where players are playing 6 years, you do see that a lot of players are returning to college, and that kind of thing ends next year, where you're going to see a significant amount of talent in next year's class, maybe one of the deeper classes that you've seen in the general over the last few years. And so that's where you might be willing to part with some of those fourth round picks, maybe fourth, fifth, sixth round picks, to move up earlier in the draft and allow those teams that maybe don't have as much capital in those rounds to then trade back and recoup some of that capital for extra spots, because the Niners don't necessarily need 12 rookies, 10 rookies. I don't expect them to have 10 rookies. And so I wouldn't be opposed to a trade up even in the first round. Going later, I do want to appreciate, though, everybody who's tuned in, everybody who's kind of asking questions and all of that. Another comment here, Ayuk deal. Would love a deal before Chase and JJ. Justin Jefferson, of course, I agree. The question to me is, ultimately, when does Ayuk believe it's best for him to have the deal? Because in my opinion, and looking in Ayuk's point of view, it's in his best interest to wait. The longer he waits, the more money he can ultimately get. And it's not like he doesn't have guaranteed money set up to where he can't wait. He's on a first round deal, and he's gotten $14 million of guaranteed money sitting with that fifth year option. And so to me, I think that he has the luxury of waiting, whereas guys who may not have had that first round capability don't as much. I do think, though, the deal hopefully comes before these two, specifically before Chase, because Chase is 1 year younger, or both guys are actually 1 year younger in terms of their NFL experience. So, those deals, they have a little more time for those to materialize, with both being first round picks in the 2021 class. But it likely will be more than what you got for Devontae Smith. I mean, this is a great question. My guy, Marco the Insider, is not here anymore. But fifth round, who will become an all-pro? We got a couple. There might be a few fifth round selections the Niners ultimately make. We'll see, because this one, everyone's going to pinpoint that fifth round selection overall. Going forward, let's see. What else did we not get to address? Joey V says, I like the idea of taking two receivers in this draft. If there were two guys who you would personally want, who would they be? Marco mentioned a few guys, and it really depends on the round. In round one, if a guy like Adonai Mitchell falls, A.D. Mitchell, the Niners should look after a guy like A.D. Mitchell. He's a guy who I think would fit this team well. Really gives the 49ers another Ayuk type receiver at 6'2", 205-ish on the outside. A guy who I think you can train to become a better blocker, but a guy who's a really good route runner. Great speed, really good route runner, good size for the position, can make the contested catches. He's also played in some big moments. I think that he is a guy who the Niners could look to target in the first round. Elsewhere, I think if you're looking for another vertical, a deep guy who I think has solid route running and can refine a little more, that's Brian Thomas. I think he could be there at 31. Although you do expect some of these pass catchers to kind of go earlier in the draft as well. I think the bread and butter for where the Niners are looking to select is the second and third round. Javon Baker was a guy from UCF that Marco mentioned. Other guys, Jalen McMillan, Ricky Pearsall, I think is also potentially in that category. I think that if you're looking maybe a little later overall, I think even you could find talent late, in that third, fourth round. Jamari Thrash, a guy who stood out at the NFL Combine, at the Senior Bowl. He's a guy who might be a little bit older, but he's a guy who you could definitely consider in that category. And then Roman Wilson, he's a second round pick, probably. Jalen Polk, who we mentioned, Malachi Corley. I think that there are a lot of names that receivers nowadays are just really talented. The group is really talented. I like the idea of taking a receiver early and then maybe taking a receiver with one of those sixth round picks. If you're looking for late round guys who I usually keep my eye on, Bub Means out of Pittsburgh. He's a guy with a good athleticism, a good frame around 6'2", 212 pounds or so. And he's a guy who could play special teams as a returner as well. I think he's a guy who I'm definitely keeping my eye on for a later round selection. Elsewhere, I know Marco mentioned Cornelius Johnson. You could even think about Luke McCaffrey. And then a guy who I'll also point out, Jaquan Jackson of Tulane, another good player there. Impact player with your first pick. I will extend that. I think you need an impact player with one of those first three picks. That's kind of the way that I look at it, because the first pick might be the guy with the highest potential, the highest ceiling out of the whole class. Just might take a little bit of time to materialize. And the Niners have the luxury of doing that, given how when you look at their class, when you look at their roster, they've got starters at nearly every spot already solidified. But I do think you're going to need an impact player at one of those first three selections. I'm curious to see what position that ultimately ends up being, because like Marco said, it could be corner. Corner, you don't necessarily have that third corner solidified, provides you comfortability if you can find that solution at corner. It could also be offensive line. I think the interior offensive line, there could be some conversation about potentially having a starter at center, maybe even right guard, where you have some competition and then some good depth behind them overall. I think those are the two positions that mainly stand out. And I think that could definitely be the case. Continuing forward, continuing forward. And this is also a good comment from 49ers Throwback. Banks is gone after the season, unfortunately. Aaron Banks is a free agent after this year. And so if you consider that offensive line, you're not only looking to build for the future, for the present maybe on the interior, but also the future, because Spencer Burford, or sorry, not Spencer Burford, John Feliciano and Aaron Banks are both free agents after this year. They're going to need two starting guards if Feliciano ultimately retires. He indicated this might be his last ride. That might boost offensive guard or interior offensive line up the boards for the 49ers, where they might consider it, or even look to get multiple guys that they believe could play. A guy who I kind of like to target in the fourth round or so is Zach Sinter out of Michigan. He's a guy who had a long-term injury. I believe he's broke his leg or fractured some portion of his leg. He's going to be out, might not even be ready back for training camp, but the Niners don't need him this year. You want a quality player who you can have later on. Zinter's a guy who could have been selected in the second round this year had he been fully healthy. That's a guy who I think would be a great value pick for a team that can afford to have a value pick, given the complexion of their roster. And so I think ultimately, when you look at the offensive line, there are a lot of spots that could be needing solutions in 2025. You might want an upgrade at right tackle. Trent Williams could retire and you might need a solution at left tackle. And then you look at the two guard spots, you might need two starters. So offensive line, you might go for both quality and quantity in this draft. And I do think that there are some good options, especially on the interior in the third and fourth rounds. I don't think that there are many good tackle options as the draft goes along. I really don't. I think this draft is pretty thin when it comes to the back end. It's not only for tackle, but for depth in general. I think you're going to try and address that within the first 2 days of the draft. But I think interior offensive linemen, you might find some good players in that fourth round range, where the Niners have 3 selections overall from 132, 135, and 124. And so I think this draft is just going to be a balance of trying to balance the present with the future. But I think one thing's clear. It's going to be a very crucial draft for the team. Why? Because when you look at the last 2 drafts, the Niners really haven't hit on much yet. You wanted immediate contributors. You got one of Jair Brown last year. That's really it. Cam Latu wasn't great. Jake Moody was below average as a kicker, which is a position that really you can't develop as much. And then nobody else really ultimately contributed that much. 2022, Brock Purdy's the only pick right now that's hit. And so you need contributors for sure this year. You need contributors not only to be immediate guys, but to be guys that are cornerstone guys for the future, because you're not going to be able to pay everybody. The Niners are already feeling the ramifications for that. You cut Arik Armstead this offseason, and the next year is the big one, because that 2021 class where you have Talanoa Hufanga, Diamondo Lenore, and other, not only just in that draft class, but you have guys across the board who are going to be free agents. I think you need to find ways to have, solutions beyond this year. Cornerback is a position. I mentioned offensive line, but you're going to need positions all across the board. The Niners might even look for another tight end, right? And then safety. Like I said, Hufanga gone, you're going to need not only depth for this year, but you're also going to need a potential starter in 2025. So I think there are a lot of positions across the board the Niners could look after. And I think safety might also be, as I wrote this morning on Niners Nation, an underrated position that the Niners might target earlier than you'd expect, because behind Jair Brown and Talanoa Hufanga right now, you don't really have much at safety. You have George Odom, who primarily the team views as a special teamer. And then you have 2 guys who were on the practice squad last year in Taylor Hawkins and Eric Harris, who are on the team. But you need a succession plan for Talanoa Hufanga, and also an insurance plan in the case that he might not be healthy. There are a lot of veteran safeties right now, but if the Niners want to go cheaper and have a cost-controlled option alongside Jair Brown, that's the way to do it, because they ultimately usually have not paid safeties top dollar during the Kyle Shanahan regime. The guy who they paid was Jimmy Ward, and he took a pay cut to remain with the Niners when he signed that 3-year, like $20 million deal. He had more money. He took a pay cut, and that's the way the Niners operate at the position. They don't value it as much, and so I think the draft is the way to go for there. I think, though, I've answered everybody's questions or everybody's comments. Once again, I really appreciate everybody who's coming into these, sharing your thoughts. We really like interacting with y'all. I really love, coming on here with Marco every single Wednesday or Thursday. And so you'll see us next Thursday for the wash party, where we're going to have a fun one. It's going to be the whole first round where we're going to be sitting there. We'll see if the Niners select. If they trade down, we might not have a selection in that entire first round, but nonetheless, it's going to be a lot of fun. Thank you guys so much for tuning in. Make sure you stay tuned for next Thursday, and we'll be back very soon.